Good evening, folks. My name's Erica. I'm a tutor at Coding Kids, and welcome to the second episode of this video series that we're doing. Today we're introducing Scratch and what it is and why it's a great tool to get started with coding. In particular, we're going to be looking at why Scratch is a great alternative to text-based programming languages like Python and Java and C++, especially when you're first getting started in with coding. So to begin with, what is Scratch? Scratch is a visual-based programming language, so in other words, it allows you to manipulate visual elements to make a program rather than making one by writing line by line of code. So in Scratch's case, when we make a program, what we're doing is dragging and dropping pre-existing boxes, each of which have their own, specific function, into the scripting area, as we call it. And when we're dragging and dropping them, we can combine them to make a program. So what a program is specifically is a set of instructions that does something when you run it. So how does a visual-based programming language like Scratch differ to a text-based programming language like C++, for example? And why don't we teach, C++ to kids getting started out with coding instead of using Scratch? So the easiest way to show you the differences between visual-based programming languages and text-based programming languages is to show you the difference between programs that we've written. So I've written a Hello World program in Scratch and in C++, and I'll show you the differences now. Hello World is just a classic sort of program that most programmers write when they're getting started with a new programming language. So I'll show you now. Let's start with the Scratch example. So with the Scratch example, it simply contains two blocks. So the first one, together what it means is when we click the flag button, so when we click this flag button over here, then our Scratch sprite will say hello world for 2 seconds. I'm not sure if you can quite see that. It'll say hello world for 2 seconds. So when we demonstrate that, when we click the flag, our Scratch sprite says hello world and then it disappears after 2 seconds. On the contrary, a C++ Hello World program looks a little something like this. I won't spare you the details of what each line means, but essentially when we run the program in the console window over here, it'll say Hello World. So, getting back to... perhaps you've noticed some of the differences between the visual-based programming language Scratch and the text-based programming language C++. So with Scratch, it was very straightforward and very simple. It only required 2 blocks to actually make a program. It's also quite readable, so for somebody who doesn't have much experience or knowledge of coding coming into that, they can sort of look at the program and get a feel for what might actually happen. With the text-based programming language, however, C++, the example was a lot more complicated. It was a lot harder to read, so somebody coming into it might look at it and be like, what is IOStream? No clue. A lot harder to sort of gauge on a first-looking basis. There are also a couple of other problems and difficulties, shall we say, when we're starting out with text-based programming languages. So there's a lot of typing involved, as you may have noticed. With the Scratch example, the most typing that we have to do is write hello world, and then that was all we really had to do, whereas with the C++ example, it required us to write about 6 or 7 lines of code to achieve roughly the same effect. So, it's a lot of unnecessary extra typing to actually get to the heart of the matter, which is writing a program that says hello world. There's also a lot of extra programming concepts involved when you're dealing with text-based programming languages, or just a lot more difficult languages like C++ or Java or anything like that. So you would have seen with the C++ example, there are you would need to know about things like headers and functions and libraries, and these are really tough concepts. What are they and how do you explain them to an 8-year-old? So it's a lot more complex than something like Scratch, where they can sort of just have a little bit of a fiddle around and drag things in and see what they can make with it. You also need to keep a special eye out with text-based programming languages on special characters. So things like colons and semicolons, if you can't distinguish between the two of them, it creates a lot of issues. In the C++ example, you might have seen at the end of most of the lines there was a semicolon, which is sort of a typing convention in C++. And if you accidentally type a colon instead of a semicolon, it can break your entire program. So for a kid who's starting to learn programming, it's not really ideal to be dealing with all of these sort of finicky details. When you're first starting out with coding, what is one of the most important things to do is to develop your programmer logic, so understanding how to build a program. So in Scratch's case, programmer logic might be understanding which blocks to use and where to put them to make your program to do the thing that you want it to do. So when you're adding things like, you know, all these extra programming concepts, and when you're adding all this unnecessary typing and all these recognition of special characters, it's just a little bit more extra and unnecessary when you're teaching somebody to code. That being said, Scratch is by no means a substitute for the things that text-based languages can do. You can't make the next social media platform on Scratch, but it is a great stepping stone, shall we say, to getting to text-based languages. You know, it gives you the chance to solidify your programming knowledge before moving on to something like C++. So I hope that this video was shed a little bit of light on the differences between visual and text-based programming languages, but of course if you have any questions or concerns or thoughts, be sure to leave them down in the comments so we can answer them later. And join us again on Thursday for an introduction to using sprites in Scratch. See you on Thursday.